unconditional love. You're either unconditional love or you're judging constantly. And therefore you're judging yourself. You know, it gets finer and finer in its understanding of I am. I keep thinking of your two boys, the roles they play. 20 years' time. I mean, holy cow, 20 years' time. That's going back to 1906. No, it was going back to 19. God, it's funny. 20 years. 1980. It'd be 25 years. 26 years.
Yeah.
1985, I sold all the mainland stations. Boy, that power structure has shifted.
Which power structure?
Chum.
Yeah.
Because you got, see, there's no way if I, is the camera on?
Yeah. Let me ask you some questions.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Why not?
Yeah. So you of all the people I know, have probably the most exceptional background in both business and philosophy. You know, you're a highly philosophical guy, but a highly successful business guy. Mm-hmm. Tell me how your understanding has changed from, say, 1975, when you really were traveling to India, to now, 30 years later. Have you learned anything? 30 years. Has anything changed? I guess that's the question.
Well, when I wrote that book about knowing that I was going to India, for example, just breaking away completely, and realizing I had a lot of questions that nobody could answer. And therefore, if you got questions that no one can answer, you try to find someone who can answer them. Well, I knew that the first question was the vibrations. I knew that my body was vibrating at a certain level. And to test it out, that theory, I researched the King's Chamber very carefully, and the whole concept of the pyramids and being an energy center with the unfilled capstone of gold, silver, and copper, as the dollar bill points out. So it's a covenant of power, of energy. So the only way you could prove it is like the big Da Vinci thing now with the codes. You go there and you meditate in the King's Chamber for a week, and you expose your cellular structure, particularly your brain structure, to the ancient vibrations by getting as close to the sarcophagus as you can get, which has been broken down by vandals a little bit, or people taking one little piece and suddenly. So after a week in the King's Chamber every day, you realize you've got to purify the body more and more, not only with your diets, but your thoughts, with your comments, with your refinements. That's why the priest took 7 years and then 3 years of oral teachings before they became initiated into the King's Chamber. That's what it was. It wasn't a burial vault. It was a chamber for initiation. You laid in the sarcophagus after 21 days of fasting to clean out your 33-foot tube, and you laid in the sarcophagus as pure as the physical entity could become, and you had an out-of-body experience by the power of the energy invested in that area, covering 13 acres at that exact height of the pyramid, under 70 tons of they talk about this was all done by a few slaves. I mean, it's ludicrous. This is an indication that there was a higher consciousness, and it left its marks. The King's Chamber, the pyramids, it just left a few things, particularly in the Andes. And if this city or the temple under the sea between Bolivia and Peru is found and verified, then we have an incredible beginning of a new adventure. Not necessarily for us, But unless we point out the areas of adventure, a Newfoundlander, for example, is the manager of the gold mine in Peru.
I have to tell you, you're the easiest interview anybody could ever hope to do. There's no short answers. Now I want to ask. Now here's a good question, because we talked about this briefly yesterday, and that is our belief systems, are obviously changing, and we forget as well. We forget those things. We have to remind ourselves of those things in life. So let me think how I put this in a question. What do you find yourself needing to remind yourself? What do you need to remind yourself up on a daily or weekly?
The first thing is that this is eternity. We're in eternity. It's not going to start tomorrow. It didn't end yesterday. It's eternity. And in that eternity, because we've been put in a physical body, and I haven't figured out yet how to remove it except through dreams at night, but I'm looking forward to the day that I could just lay here and suddenly become Jonathan Seagull by my ability to transfer my consciousness into the bird that's going around here, which I'm quite sure we can do, just as we can telepathy and all the other stuff. Because if I'm only operating with 10% of my brain, and that has given me the survival, it has given me the protection, it's done the, it's carried me to this point. But now to open the heart completely in unconditional love, which is basically Christ consciousness. Do unto others, love one another, but first of all, love yourself, to develop yourself. You're a classic example of being a self-starter. Not everybody, very few people are self-starters. Mañana. It's always mañana. They got lots of great ideas. They got great thoughts. They got great suggestions. But it's mañana. It doesn't happen.
Yeah. You sent me a fabulous joke about 15 years ago about the fisherman in Mexico who had a wonderful life. He had a simple life. He went out, caught some fish, had siesta in the afternoon, spent time with his family. But the Harvard grad came down and looked at what he was doing and said, if you work harder, you can have another boat. You can have a crew of people working for you. And eventually, 20 years out, you can have essentially the same life you have now.
Yeah, right. That's exactly it. Well, Alexander the Great.
Let me ask you this. This is my specific question.
Okay.
What is nirvana for the human race? If you could design society on a global scale,
right?
Can you simply tell me what that would be? What is nirvana for the human race?
Well, accepting the premise that the human race, as we know it, was in a quarantined zone on the planet, and the quarantine is over. If we can accept all this, I mean, if we can say, look, all of this been coming down from all the psychics and all the predictors, and I knew the beginning publisher of this coming in from Wickenburg back and forth and so on. The material coming out of channeling is how they got the Bible. You have to assume the same way as the material in that magazine.
Yeah. But I'm gonna bring you back to this question, because specifically, because you can close your eyes and think, okay, what is the state of nirvana for a human individual, and then how do we transfer that on a global scale?
Yeah, well, what I'm saying is that if I've only got 10% of my brain, you're asking me a question to someone who has 10% of his brain operative and accepts that.
I think you have more.
Well, okay, so I got 11%. Well, what I'm saying is that as we accept the premise that we're in eternity and we're in kindergarten, to project ahead is simply to say, are you doing more meaningful? Are you happier with your family? Are you not feeling any hatred for yourself because your head is too big or your shoulders are too thin? Have you reached an internal state of peace with the self? Well, that was what I'd wish for everybody.
That's a great answer.
Because that's it. I mean, to no longer be hypnotized by the activity of materialism. Because most people are. I mean, we're in the field of that very temptation.
Well, here's a question, because obviously, you know, our philosophical beliefs or our philosophical nirvana, the happiness that we can feel, is tied in to some degree to our economic system, how we provide for ourselves and how we shelter ourselves and feed ourselves. Where do you see capitalism heading? Where would we, you know, if right now we are in a very consumer-oriented society, but how could that possibly change? If you could use your imagination for a moment, where do you think it could go?
Well, the only systems I've seen in this lifetime. You've got communism, which is socialism basically, which is bureaucracy. I mean, it's just names. Because the bureaucracy really controls this country. I mean, you talk about North America, Canada more than anywhere, because the bureaucracy is so entrenched with long, I mean, the Americans realized how dangerous it was to have a president for more than 8 years, because he suddenly appointed the head of the CIA, the FBI, the alcohol, and the guys who created the name marijuana to reinstate their agency, which had been dissolved when Prohibition ended. There was 25,700 alcohol and weaponry agency, and that agency appointed and created the FBI. That agency appointed the CIA, and that agency burnt to death 105 American citizens in Waco, Texas, when George was the governor, as little as 12 years ago, on the record.
I'll go back to that question, which is, right now the capitalist system, or the socioeconomic system that we have, we create value, and in exchange for that value, we're giving a currency to buy those things that we need. But most of the value that is created now, is in material goods, cars, clothes, houses, consumer items. If we were to go to a system that had less tangible value being created to something more service-oriented, how would you see that world? For instance, the microcosm of that question is Newfoundland, where we were basically taking a resource out of the water and using that resource to make our living. How can you evolve from a tangible-based resource economy to a service-oriented intellectual economy?
Well, first of all, it's vital to say numbers don't make a great society. Iceland with 200,000, so we could be, if we wanted to grasp it, going from the joke of Canada to the intellectual center of Canada, and utilizing all of the new knowledge we have of mind control and all of that stuff, and focus on what we want to be. But you've got to have I'm repeating what I said in '75, that you've got to have a 25-year plan. You start by distributing land. Whether the land is wanted or rejected, you distribute land to give a feeling of landed gentry, of security, that you've got some land other than the land you're going to be buried in. And because we have only 600,000 in an area bigger than 12 American states in landmass, 12 American states are not as big as Newfoundland, Labrador. Newfoundland, Labrador is about the same size as Japan, and they have 150 million, and would have 300 million if they didn't have organized abortion, 100,000 every week. Just as China has a one-child policy. I don't know what happens if you have twins. Heavy stuff. Because they're taking on what is the perfect land.
I'll go back, because you've been alive long enough to have recognized some changes in the way the economy's worked. What have you noticed? What's different today than what existed, say, 50 years ago?
Well, it's become a global economy. I mean, Marshall McLuhan, when I was at university, I mean, was right on. I mean, he was in Toronto, I think Toronto, York University, and he pointed out, and it was obvious then, that with the satellites and with everything, the collective consciousness is starting to come down, and you realize, if you can, that you're one cell in the brain of God, and God is everything. Well, as we start to go from 10% of our brain to 10 or 11% to 12%, we're no longer like Jonathan Seagull fighting for fish heads on the shore. We're not so preoccupied that we live for food. We're earning for food, we're buying food, we're preparing for food, we're cooking food, we're eating food, we're cleaning up after food. We hope the head waiter got our name. We want to be by a window. We want to wear a dress that we just got. We have somewhere to go. We have to have social contact. We have to send a man out in the factory so we can stay here and eat our fudge and watch soaps. What's your next question, sir? Because religion or hope.
Well, let me ask on to that. What you just said then is food a bigger part of life today than it was 50 years ago?